It was summer, the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state, you know that it's very long and very barren. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't usually have much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert over and over again. I started to get a headache, so my husband suggested I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of the desert sunset out the car window. I woke up when I felt the car start to slow down, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I figured it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop and told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing that I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired, and as I made my way down the hallway, I realized just how badly I needed to go, so I shuffled my way into the bathroom. As I made my way to one of the stalls, I made eye contact with a woman who was coming out of the further stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but was definitely messy looking. She had wild gray hair, which would have been shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out in every direction from her head. It looked like she hadn't brushed it in weeks. She was wearing ragged-looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts and foam flip-flops, several layers on top, one of which was a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this was Texas in July, so it was strange to see someone so bundled up. The jacket was hanging on her shoulders, crooked, like she hadn't bothered to take more than a second to put it on correctly. She was carrying something tied up in a plastic grocery bag. I gave her a quick smile as our eyes met, but she just stared in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes just had this wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this was when I felt like something was wrong. I tried to brush it off as she waddled over to the only sink. I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. She was tense, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to spring into action. Her arms were at her side, elbows slightly bent, not even bothering to wash her hands or fix her hair in the mirror. I felt really uncomfortable seeing her standing like this, not sure exactly what she was up to. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind because I knew I had no way to contact my husband if I needed to. I shut and locked the stall door, taking my time on the toilet. I wanted to make sure she was gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I continued waiting. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I could hear it open and slam close as a wave of relief washed over me. But as I reached for the stall lock, I paused, staying as silent as I could, trying to confirm what I thought I was hearing. After a moment, I undoubtedly knew it was breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she left? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer this time. I have no way of knowing for sure, but it felt like I was in there for at least 20 minutes. I could tell from the direction of her breathing that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough away that I couldn't see her feet. It was all very intentional. Finally, I heard her leave, and this time I waited a few minutes, listening for her breathing to confirm she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall, washed my hands as quickly as possible, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside by then, and I had no idea where she was, but I knew she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited by a window display until he left and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door was this woman. She seemed surprised when she saw me and the large man, so she turned away, walking quickly around the corner side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay, since I had taken so much longer than he had expected. I told him all about what happened as we pulled him away from the store and continued on our way. Looking back, I think the most likely explanations were that she was either trying to mug me or that she was somehow involved in sex trafficking. I tried to see if anything had popped up in the news around that time, but I'm still not exactly sure where we were when this happened. Two of my friends and I were looking to take a vacation, so we decided on a road trip from New York to New Orleans. We wanted to save money though, so we decided to use the Greyhound to make a few stops on our last leg of the trip before we got to our final destination. We ended up regretting this decision, since our experience at the Atlanta Greyhound station was the most scared we had ever been in our lives. We knew we had made the wrong choice as soon as we reached the station. We arrived in Atlanta at night. This was 8 or 9 years ago, so I'm not sure about the exact time, but it was definitely past 11 p.m. The hotel we were staying in wasn't far from the bus station, so we checked our map and decided it would be best to walk. I lived in a big city in the States at the time though, so I should have known better. It wasn't long before we were approached by a man with an available cab. We got a weird vibe from him, so we turned him down and continued walking. 3 well-to-do young men dragging large suitcases down a very bad part of the city. Less than a minute after leaving the station, we were approached by a lady who I'm sure was on crack. She kept saying that she needed some money, and that if we went with her, she would show us a good time. We kept repetitively saying no as we walked faster. Finally, she dropped back, but we kept glancing over our shoulders to make sure she wasn't following. That was when we noticed 3 guys in bandanas walking 10 to 20 feet behind us. We stopped to adjust our suitcases and noticed that they also stopped at the same time, and that's when panic really set in. Just at that moment, the crackhead lady came back, even more aggressive this time, telling us she needed money and promising to make it worth our while. All of this commotion seemed to get the attention of a bouncer at the strip club we were passing by. This guy was massive, and luckily took mercy on us and yelled at the lady to get away from us. After some back and forth, another man who seemed to know this crackhead walked over and started loudly arguing with the bouncer. A security officer from the Greyhound station finally saw what was happening and came over to lecture us about walking away from the station at night. He strongly recommended grabbing a cab wherever we were going, no matter how close. By this time, the 3 bandana guys were nowhere to be seen, but even so, the officer was kind enough to walk us back to the station. At the taxi area, the man who had originally offered us a ride was the only cab available. The officer walked over and told him to drive us. We should have felt better at this point, but we soon realized why we hadn't felt right about the cab driver the first time around. Once he exited the station and took his first couple turns, he punched the accelerator and started mumbling to himself. What should have been a very short cab ride took at least twice as long as we expected. It wasn't until we said for the 3rd time that we were heading away from our destination that he finally turned around and stopped outside the hotel. The cab had controls for self-locking the doors, and we noticed he had us completely locked in. After mumbling to himself for another few minutes or so, he started hitting the wheel. We were already on edge from all the experiences we had that night, but at this point, we were in sheer panic mode. He then half shouted at us, asking why we said no to him earlier, asking if there was something wrong with the way he looked, asking why we just took off. We tried explaining to him that we thought the hotel could be easily reached on foot and that we weren't familiar with Atlanta. Still trying to alleviate the situation, we paid him a reasonable tip, not wanting to piss him off further. Finally, we got out and booked it up to the hotel entrance. As we entered the hotel, I looked over my shoulder to see him leaning against the passenger side of the car, just staring at us with an angry look in his eyes. The hotel itself was sketchy too, and we were petrified that the cab driver was still outside. Despite barricading our room door, none of us slept well that night. We switched to a nicer hotel in the city the next day, and I can promise that if I ever go to Atlanta again, I will never, ever take the bus. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on a road trip from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging around the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s and pretty broke, but my mom had been a long-haul trucker and suggested that we save some money by sleeping in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut up one set to make a set of curtains. By the end of the first week, we were so well practiced that we could set up camp in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, and bedding laid down for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, basically anywhere it seemed safe and semi-legal. We felt a little weird the first night, but after that there wasn't a single night where we felt scared. Until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten really used to our routine. We didn't go on a set schedule and never had a specific destination in mind. We would just drive for 3 or 4 hours a day, stopping at interesting places we would find on Google, or taking suggestions from other campers and locals we would meet along the way. We had gotten really good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a couple of rednecks we met at a campsite in the back of their pickup. We met a 90-year-old cowboy who took us drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. Played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm. Got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them. And spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was great. This particular night didn't seem to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up. There was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello, but he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything at all, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the entire time. Figuring he just wanted some privacy, we pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while there was still light out, we ended up goofing around for a while, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tez finally pointed out a campfire further down the site, and we decided to see if we could go make friends. We had met so many people in the previous 5 weeks just by going up and offering beer or chatting, so we wandered over with high hopes. Near the campfire were 2 men, the owners of the cars we had seen earlier. They seemed friendly, so we sat down to enjoy a beer or 2 with them before heading to bed. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out they didn't actually know each other. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs. He was spinning around in circles and talking about UFOs, but he seemed harmless. Since he was pretty preoccupied, we ended up mostly chatting with the younger man, who told us he was a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, so we ended up spending several hours just talking about our trip and families. Then he told us about the bear. He had apparently seen a bear earlier in the forest, but Tez didn't believe him, so he pulled out his camera to show her photos. It was very close to the campsite in the photos he showed us, and we were both a little freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear so close really spooked us. The ranger laughed when he saw how scared we were, and then his expression suddenly changed. His voice went cold as he said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laugh, or for him to nudge us with his elbow, but he never did. I laughed awkwardly to break the silence and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. Tez laughed as well and chimed in with a joke about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We tried moving on to another subject, but the ranger steered the conversation back to murderers and started talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how much we tried to change the conversation, he kept latching back on. The older man was high as a kite at this point, just looking up at the sky and not talking, so we kept sipping our beers and awkwardly laughing, hoping that the conversation would go somewhere else. The ranger stood up at one point to grab another beer, walking out of the light from the campfire. Suddenly, there was a red dot in the darkness, and it took me a moment to realize that it was his camera. The ranger was still holding his camera. I could see the screen light up and knew he had taken a picture of us. Now, it isn't odd for people we've met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous. Dark hair, blue eyes, just like a young Megan Fox, and we were really friendly. This was entirely different. A stranger taking a photo of us without even asking, or telling us he was doing it. We were both just staring at him like deer in the headlights, but instead of realizing how fucking weird he was being, he just checked his camera, adjusted some settings, and took another photo, this time with the flash on. When he finished, he came back to the fire and sat down without saying a word about the camera or the photos he had taken. At this point, Taz and I were both freaked out, so we made up some bullshit excuse about needing to set up our campsite and left as quickly as possible. As we stood up to leave, the older man turned towards us and smiled and told us to have a good night. The ranger, however, looked at us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair in my body stood on end hearing that. Tez laughed out an awkward response and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car and jumped in the front seat. Tez was on the verge of hyperventilating. "Why did he take pictures of us?" she asked. I was shaking and responded, "I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims." She stared at me for a second and then locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both started freaking out, and in a panic, she turned on the headlights of the car. I yelled at her to turn them back off since she was giving away our location. Thank God we didn't set up camp that night because we didn't have anything to tear down, so we just put the car in drive and floored it out of the campsite. As we got onto the dirt road, we could see the ranger walking towards our car with that same cold expression.